The November wind cut through the designer silk curtains like frozen knives as watched his mistress arrange her Louis luggage across the California king bed, the same bed where his wife should have been sleeping. But Sarah wasn't in the bedroom. She was outside, 7 months pregnant, kneeling beside the weathered wooden structure had commanded her to sleep in tonight, the abandoned doghouse at the edge of their estate. Had built his pharmaceutical empire from nothing, or so the Forbes articles claimed. 20 years of what he called strategic vision had transformed a single patent into a global corporation worth $4.8 billion. But the truth hiding in offshore accounts and shell corporations told a different story. The truth that Sarah had discovered 3 months ago during a routine review of documents her attorneys had flagged. The truth that would destroy everything believed he controlled. Sarah's knees pressed against frozen concrete, her swollen belly making every movement an exercise in careful calculation. The doghouse loomed before her, a cruel wooden cage built for the Rottweiler they'd owned 5 years ago, before the dog died, before decided that pharmaceutical conferences were convenient covers for extramarital adventures with women who mistook wealth for character. Her hands didn't shake from the November cold. They shook from anticipation. Behind her, through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master suite, she could hear laughter mixing with deeper chuckle. A symphony of betrayal that would have shattered Sarah's heart if her heart hadn't already transformed into something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous over the past 90 days of meticulous planning. The phone in Sarah's coat pocket buzzed. One message, 3 words that changed everything. Documents filed, it's done. Sarah allowed herself a smile as she crawled into the doghouse, the smell of rotted wood and old memories surrounding her like a funeral shroud. By sunrise, the pharmaceutical empire would belong to someone new. By noon, and his mother would be signing eviction notices. By sunset, the man who'd forced his pregnant wife to sleep like an animal would be begging on streets he used to own. But didn't know any of this yet. He was too busy celebrating his freedom. 6 months earlier, Sarah had noticed the signs before grew careless enough to leave evidence. The late-night, emergency board meetings that happened at luxury hotels. The unexplained charges on credit cards he didn't realize she monitored through her private financial network. The cologne that clung to his custom suits, expensive, overpowering, desperately trying to announce sophistication, but actually screaming insecurity. She'd hired investigators on a Tuesday. By Friday, she had photographs. The penthouse suite at the Mandarin Oriental, 3 different occasions, each one documented with timestamps, location data, and image quality that would hold up in any courtroom in America. But Sarah didn't want a courtroom. She wanted annihilation. The investigation had revealed something more valuable than evidence of adultery. It revealed the architecture of his empire, the leveraged buyouts, the shadow corporations, the creative accounting that made his $4.8 billion valuation look solid, while actually resting on foundations more fragile than spun sugar. Sarah's financial advisor, a woman named who'd managed the $8.7 billion trust Sarah had inherited from her grandfather, had studied the reports for 72 hours before calling with a question that launched everything that followed. Do you want to own it, all of it? Sarah had paused for exactly 4 seconds before responding with words that sealed fate. I want to own everything he thinks is his, and I want him to watch me take it. The acquisition had been surgical. Sarah's network of blind trusts and offshore entities purchased every loan, every mortgage, every promissory note connected to pharmaceuticals. The company believed he controlled through majority shares had actually been mortgaged 17 different ways, creating vulnerabilities that Sarah exploited with the precision of a neurosurgeon removing a tumor. She'd paid fair market value for everything, sometimes more than fair. The transactions were completely legal, meticulously documented, and absolutely irreversible. Never noticed, because rich men never believed their quiet wives understood finance. That mistake would cost him everything. The mother-in-law had hated Sarah from their first meeting at a charity gala 9 years ago. The older woman had built her identity around being the matriarch of pharmaceutical royalty, hosting fundraisers and serving on hospital boards and presenting herself as old money, conveniently forgetting that her own father had been a dental equipment salesman who'd gotten lucky with patents in the 1970s. Sarah threatened, carefully constructed narrative simply by existing as someone who didn't perform wealth the way demanded. Sarah wore simple clothes, drove a hybrid sedan, donated anonymously instead of demanding buildings named after her. She refused to participate in the social climbing considered essential to maintaining status. The tension had simmered beneath expensive dinner parties for years, but it erupted into open warfare when Sarah announced her pregnancy 7 months ago. Had immediately begun campaigning to reconsider his options, a transparent suggestion that he divorce his pregnant wife and find someone more suitable. Someone who understood that marriages in their tax bracket were strategic alliances rather than romantic partnerships. Then appeared and treated her arrival like an answered prayer. Was 26 years old, 8 years younger than Sarah, and worked as a pharmaceutical sales consultant, which was corporate terminology for someone who smiled at conferences and made wealthy men feel important. She'd met at an industry event in Miami, recognized his vulnerability to flattery, and attached herself to him with the practiced efficiency of a parasite that had perfected its evolutionary strategy. Fell completely, mistaking her professional charm for genuine attraction, her calculated availability for authentic desire. Encouraged the affair with disturbing enthusiasm, inviting to family dinners, and introducing her as business partner, a fiction so transparent it insulted everyone's intelligence, but satisfied's need to pretend her son wasn't openly destroying his marriage while his wife carried his child. 3 hours ago, had thrown Sarah's luggage onto the lawn. She'd screamed that a woman who couldn't give her son a proper heir didn't deserve to live under their roof, ignoring the medical reality that Sarah was 7 months pregnant with his daughter. Sarah had stood silently during the tirade, watching her belongings scatter across manicured grass. But she'd been thinking about the legal documents that were simultaneously transferring ownership of his beloved estate, his corporate headquarters, and the entire pharmaceutical empire into Sarah's name through a web of shell corporations, so complex that forensic accountants would need months to trace the connections. Had no idea she'd just assaulted the woman who now legally owned her home. The doghouse. The structure measured 4 feet by 6 feet, barely large enough for Sarah's pregnant body. The wood smelled of decay and abandonment. The single blanket she'd brought provided minimal insulation against the November cold. But Sarah had chosen this final humiliation deliberately, because the contrast between tonight's degradation and tomorrow's revelation would make her victory that much more devastating. Her daughter kicked inside her womb, strong, insistent movements that felt like solidarity. Sarah placed her hand on her belly, whispering promises that her daughter would never tolerate a man who confused wealth with worth, would never mistake cruelty for strength, would understand that power without character was just temporary noise waiting to collapse under its own emptiness. The master bedroom light glowed yellow against the darkening sky. Sarah could see shadows moving behind curtains and celebrating their night together, completely unaware they were celebrating in a bedroom Sarah now legally owned. Another message arrived at 11:47 p.m. Bank accounts frozen, foreclosure notices delivered, federal investigation opened into fraudulent loan applications, all assets secured. Sarah typed her response with fingers that had stopped trembling. Execute final phase at dawn. She set her phone aside and closed her eyes, listening to the November wind howl through bare tree branches. In 7 hours, this world would end. Not with violence or drama, but with mathematics. The cold calculation of consequences that always followed cruelty when someone patient enough finally decided to collect. Dawn. The first scream came at 6:14 a.m. His voice shattered the morning quiet, a piercing shriek that sent crows fleeing from nearby trees. Sarah could hear her former mother-in-law even from inside the doghouse, shouting about mistakes and incompetence and demanding explanations for the legal documents taped to the mansion's front door. The master bedroom window burst open moments later. His voice joined his mother's in angry disbelief, calling for attorneys and staff and anyone who could explain why official notices declared that pharmaceuticals, the family estate, and every property bearing their name now belonged to something called Meridian Global Holdings, LLC. Sarah waited exactly 5 more minutes before emerging from the doghouse. Her body ached from the night's confinement. Her pregnant belly made standing difficult. But she forced herself upright and walked slowly toward the terrace where and stood in silk pajamas, clutching foreclosure notices and screaming into phones at attorneys who weren't answering their early morning calls. Appeared behind them, wrapped in one of Sarah's designer robes, her face confused but not yet frightened, still believing mistresses could walk away from consequences they'd helped create. Saw Sarah first, her face contorted with rage that temporarily overrode her confusion. His finger stabbed towards Sarah like a weapon. That woman is still here. Security. Get this trash off our property before. Your property? Sarah's voice cut through the November air with surgical precision. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Turned toward his wife with an expression mixing annoyance and dismissal, clearly viewing her as an irrelevant distraction from serious matters. Sarah, go back outside. Adults are handling something important. His tone carried the same contempt he'd used for months. Make yourself useful and call your father's old attorney friends. See if they can help with this bizarre legal attack we're. His words died when Sarah smiled at him. It was an expression he'd never seen before. An expression of complete control mixed with patient vindication. Meridian Global Holdings, Sarah said quietly, is one of 19 shell corporations I control through my private investment network. The terrace went silent, except for the November wind. I spent 3 months systematically purchasing every mortgage, every loan, every deed associated with pharmaceuticals and family properties. As of 4:47 p.m. yesterday afternoon, I own 100% of what you believed was your empire. His face went white. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Began backing toward the house, recognizing a sinking ship. That includes, Sarah continued, her voice never rising above conversational volume, this estate you're standing on, the corporate headquarters downtown, every research facility, every patent portfolio, every subsidiary and shell company used to hide assets from tax authorities. She pulled out her phone, displaying wire transfer records. I paid fair market value for everything. Actually, slightly above market value. The transactions are completely legal and entirely irreversible. Found his voice, though it emerged as a strangled whisper. That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. You couldn't possibly. My grandfather left me $8.7 billion, Sarah said. You knew about the trust fund. You just never bothered asking how much was in it. You assumed I was dependent on you because that made you feel powerful. The truth landed like a physical blow. Had spent 9 years married to a woman whose wealth made his pharmaceutical empire look like a lemonade stand. He'd treated her like a dependent, forced her to sleep outside like an animal, given their bedroom to his mistress. All while she could have purchased his entire company 17 times over. Your attorneys, Sarah continued, were served termination notices this morning. I also purchased their outstanding legal bills through a debt collection agency I privately own, so they're no longer representing you due to conflicts of interest. Tried to interrupt, her voice shrill with desperation. This is fraud. This is illegal. Our lawyers will. Your lawyers, Sarah said calmly, are currently explaining to federal investigators why applied for 17 different loans using asset valuations. My forensic accountants discovered quite a bit of creative accounting during the acquisition process. The FBI seemed very interested. His face progressed through several shades of red and purple. The bank accounts, he managed. Frozen pending investigation, Sarah confirmed. The luxury cars in your garage, purchased through loans secured against properties I now own, subject to immediate repossession. The artwork on your walls, same situation. The furniture you're looking at, also purchased through credit lines I've terminated. She paused, letting the full scope of his destruction sink in. You have 72 hours to vacate this estate and all other properties. Security will escort you to collect personal items, clothing, photographs, items of genuine sentimental value. Everything else belongs to me now. Chose that moment to abandon ship with impressive speed, announcing she didn't sign up for this drama and needed to call a car service because she had better options than staying with a man who was apparently homeless. Actually grabbed the mistress's arm, begging her to stay because needed support. But shook free with disgust and disappeared into the house, leaving standing alone with his mother and pregnant wife while his world crumbled. Sarah watched the mistress retreat with satisfaction, noting how quickly loyalty evaporated when money disappeared. I actually loved you once, Sarah said too, her voice carrying the weight of genuine grief beneath steel resolve. Genuinely, completely, but love requires respect to survive, and respect is something you abandon the moment you chose her over our marriage vows. She placed her hand on her pregnant belly. This experience didn't create my desire for consequences. That built up over months while I watched you transform from husband to stranger. But forcing me to sleep in a doghouse while giving our bedroom to your mistress, that confirmed my plan was justice rather than cruelty. Tried one final appeal, her aristocratic composure cracking. Sarah, please, think of the baby, think of family, we can work this out. Made mistakes, but... You threw my luggage onto the lawn, Sarah interrupted. You screamed that I didn't deserve to live under your roof. You filmed me sleeping outside and sent the video to your country club friends as entertainment. She looked at with eyes that held no forgiveness. Now you'll experience exactly what you wished on me. Homelessness, humiliation, and the crushing realization that cruelty always creates consequences. Sarah walked away at 7:23 a.m., leaving and standing among foreclosure notices while moving trucks arrived to begin repossessing their possessions. As she climbed into the car waiting at the front gate, she felt her daughter kick one final time, as if acknowledging that sometimes the only way to teach people about respect is to show them what life looks like without the power they'd abused for far too long. 3 years later, Sarah stood in the nursery of her penthouse overlooking Manhattan, watching her daughter build towers from wooden blocks. The child had dark hair and Sarah's calculating eyes, a combination suggesting she would grow into someone formidable. But Sarah was teaching her daughter to wield power with compassion rather than cruelty. The family had scattered like debris after an explosion. Lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Queens, working as a pharmaceutical sales representative for a company that paid him $68,000 annually, generous by normal standards, but crushing poverty for a man who'd once believed he controlled billions. Sarah's investigators reported he'd aged dramatically, his hair graying prematurely, his posture reflecting the weight of irreversible mistakes. He'd attempted communication 19 times the first year. Letters progressing from angry accusations to desperate pleas to hollow apologies that acknowledged failure without comprehending the depth of his betrayal. Sarah had filed each letter without responding. Had perhaps suffered the most complete reversal, moving from her 30-room estate to a subsidized senior facility in New Jersey. Sarah had established a small trust, providing basic necessities while denying any luxuries, strategic rather than merciful. She wanted alive to witness how the empire she'd helped build through inherited money had been transferred to the granddaughter she'd never respected. Had predictably moved on to her next target within weeks, attaching herself to a tech entrepreneur currently under federal investigation. But Sarah had ensured's role in the destruction followed her through carefully placed information in social circles where mistresses were still judged harshly. The pharmaceutical empire had been restructured under Sarah's ownership into something more ethical and substantially more profitable. She'd implemented fair labor practices, reasonable pricing, and patient assistance programs that her business managers initially resisted as leaving money on the table, but which ultimately generated better returns through improved reputation and reduced legal liability. The portfolio had managed to extract $4.8 billion from what was now worth over $12 billion under Sarah's stewardship, proving that compassion and capitalism weren't mutually exclusive. Sarah had kept 3 properties from the original holdings as reminders, but sold or donated the rest to focus on acquisitions that didn't carry emotional weight. The Doghouse had been demolished within a week, reduced to splinters and burned in a private ceremony. Sarah had saved 1 piece of wood, a small plank now mounted in her office with its handprint pressed into white paint as a reminder that even the darkest moments could transform into something meaningful. Looked up from her blocks and smiled with unself-conscious joy. A 3-year-old who didn't yet understand her family history contained betrayal, revenge, and systematic destruction of her father's legacy. But someday Sarah would explain everything in age-appropriate increments. Had requested monthly supervised visitation through a court-appointed attorney. Sarah had agreed, not from forgiveness, but because she wanted to form her own opinions rather than inheriting Sarah's justified anger. The visits were awkward and painful. Brought modest gifts he could barely afford, trying to explain to a toddler why Daddy lived in a small apartment and didn't see her more often. But Sarah watched from behind one-way glass, trying to separate her role as wounded wife from her responsibility as mother who didn't want to weaponize her daughter's affections. The master bedroom where had prioritized his mistress had been completely renovated, stripped to studs, and rebuilt with Sarah's aesthetic rather than the decorator's vision from her marriage. She slept there now when she stayed at the estate she'd converted into a weekend retreat. The mansion itself had been partially transformed into a residential facility for pregnant women escaping domestic violence, funded through Sarah's charitable foundation. She occasionally visited to share her story with residents who needed to understand that circumstances could change with strategy and patience. Had written 1 letter 6 months ago, the first communication since the foreclosure morning. It contained no genuine apology, just circular reasoning about family forgiveness. But there was a paragraph near the end that caught Sarah's attention. I sometimes dream about the day I threw your luggage onto the lawn. Except in the dreams, it's my own belongings scattering across the grass while you watch from the terrace. I wake up understanding, just for a moment before defensiveness returns, that karma is mathematics with a longer calculation period. Sarah had filed the letter without responding, deciding's fragmentary self-awareness wasn't sufficient for reconciliation. Called for attention, holding up her block tower with impressive stability. Sarah knelt beside her daughter to admire the architecture while thinking about foundations and how structures collapsed when they weren't built with integrity. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but the most important lessons rarely were. You treated people with dignity, or you lost everything built on their backs. You respected your pregnant wife, or you ended up alone and diminished. And you never forced someone to sleep in a doghouse unless you were prepared to discover that person owned the dog, the house, and everything you'd mistakenly believed was yours. Sarah kissed forehead and promised silently that her daughter would understand these truths, not through experiencing betrayal, but through witnessing her mother's choices and hearing stories explaining why kindness wasn't weakness and why power without compassion was just cruelty waiting to consume itself. The sunset painted the sky in shades reminding Sarah of the dawn, when she'd emerged from the doghouse to reveal the truth that crushed Swirled. 3 years of distance had transformed her anger into sad acceptance that some people never learned until consequences destroyed them completely. She didn't regret her response. The systematic acquisition, the foreclosure notices, the frozen accounts, the evictions. Proportionate consequences were justice rather than revenge. And justice was something her grandfather had taught her to pursue with mathematical precision. But she did sometimes wonder if there had been a moment during those 3 months of silent planning when she could have chosen differently, could have confronted directly and given him a chance at redemption before executing total destruction. Whether that alternative path might have served interests better than the satisfaction Sarah gained from watching her enemies scatter into poverty and regret. The question remained theoretical. Sarah couldn't reverse 3 years of choices and consequences. Couldn't the doghouse or the property deeds or unfreeze the bank accounts that left the family desperate and diminished. What she could do was ensure learned from both parents' mistakes, from betrayal and from Sarah's calculated vengeance, and developed into someone who understood that power was most impressive when restrained, that wealth meant nothing without character, and that the person sleeping in the doghouse today might be the billionaire who owns your tomorrow. Making kindness not just a moral imperative, but a practical strategy for anyone who wanted to build something lasting beyond their own lifetime. Sarah held her daughter close as sunset deepened into twilight, thinking about beginnings and endings and the eternal cycle of consequences connecting them. She made a silent promise to that whatever else happened in their lives, her daughter would never spend a single night wondering if her mother valued her dignity, her safety, or her fundamental worth as a human being deserving of respect. The doghouse was gone, burned to ash and memory, but its lesson remained carved into Sarah's understanding of human nature and power dynamics. Cruelty always generated mathematics that eventually balanced through loss. Underestimating quiet people destroyed empires. And forcing your pregnant wife to sleep outside while giving the master bedroom to your mistress was the kind of mistake that crushed everything you'd built and left you homeless in ways transcending merely lacking shelter, making you a refugee from your own character flaws, with nowhere left to hide from consequences you'd authored through arrogance, betrayal, and the catastrophic miscalculation that dignity was something you could selectively grant or withhold, based on temporary desires rather than permanent obligations.